got our first speaker, Sofiya M. She's a technical writing manager at Fabric, passionate about product management, and bringing that perspective into documentation is her area of expertise. She's worked with various organizations in shaping their documentation departments, developing documentation strategies, and building teams. As a passionate community volunteer, she spends the majority of her free time working with immigrants from her community, helping them feel at home and building a community to keep the next generation close to their roots and ethnicity. She lives on the West Coast with her husband, 2 kids, and close to 100 houseplants. Her dream in life is pretty simple at this point: free access to all-inclusive vacations with childcare. Please welcome to her first Write the Docs talk, Sofiya M.
Thank you, Jerome. We happen to be ex-tapes, so we were sharing a little bit of our miseries that we shared at one point in time, which was historical. Good morning, everybody. I'm a little nervous because it's my first time, but I'll do it. I hope you all have a great day too at Write the Docs. I'm sure most of you must have dealt with, this is before the time of AirPods, you must have dealt with the tangled earphones in your bag. Can you relate? Yeah, I'm sure. I did too. You stare at it with frustration, thinking how to untangle it and use it. This is exactly how documentation in startup organizations look like. Messy, tangled, a web of tangled wire. I'm Sofiya Minnath, a senior technical writing manager at Fabric Inc., which is a headless API e-commerce company. Today, I'll be walking you through a strategic documentation template to untangle the mess and define the path forward. I have divided the template into 3 key phases to effectively manage the complexity. First, we will focus on untangling the web. Then we will see how to plan, prioritize, and implement the findings that we did through untangling the web. And after that, we will measure the impact of the implementation. Let's start with untangling the web for content, tools, and resources. I address the foundational challenges by dissecting and clarifying the mess. When joining an organization, most of the times I get a list of pain points, which looks like the parent problems. But the approach that I often take is I take a step back, look at the problems in my own views, and using my own experience, I come up with a list of pain points and try to find out the root causes, which might be different from the original list of problems that you might already have with you. In each phase of this analysis, I have included a list of questions, which I will not discuss here. So I would suggest, if you want, take a picture of those questions. Those are questions you can ask in each of these phases. Let's start with the basic, the content. I approach documentation as a product because I'm a product management enthusiast. So I apply all those learning in documentation. This helps me understand users' needs and align with the organization objectives in the bigger scheme of things. Identifying user persona is the first thing that I do, audience analysis. Understand who you write for and what are the tasks and goals that they usually do, and does your content align with the user journey? Do you have a workflow that match with the journey of the users? Find out these things and get answers for this, which will later be converted into the opportunities. Competitor analysis. Why is this so important? This helps you in multiple ways. One, to understand how does the documentation in the same landscape of products looks like, what the users usually look for, and you can also understand the opportunities for which I use the analysis called SWOT analysis. Many of you might be familiar with that. Strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats, all of which can be converted into your own opportunities to implement within the documentation. Let's look at it this way. Strength, what is best in their documentation? Let's take that. Next is weakness, right? So what do they lack? Oh, they don't have that. Let me do that. Now, opportunities. They have it, but not so good. Let me do that better. Threats. Oh my God, they excel in that. They have that. For example, AI-powered search. We don't have that. let's make it an opportunity and implement in our docs. So use this analysis to understand your opportunities and implement them. Next is what we all are expert in, content requirement gathering. This is where we map the user persona with the content that they need. And we try to find out the deliverables that we want to deliver and the types of content. Yesterday, Candy mentioned about the information architecture and data, and this is one principle that I often see myself using across the organization because the categorization of content into concept, reference, and task usually helps in getting perspective about the content that you plan to deliver. Everyone has their own choices, but I usually go with that. Content quality. I don't think I have to go into the details of this section because you all are pros in this. But how do we use consistency in style and tone in usability is something that I want to cover today. Cognitive load of user is very important. When you switch from one context to another, and when you switch the style and tones from one session to another, the cognitive load of the reader increases, which makes them stop reading the content, thereby reducing the engagement. This is why I include consistency in tone and style, not in quality of the content, but in usability, because that's where it matters most, because you have to make sure users engage with your content. Content organization, how you arrange the content, the table of content and all that, which is pretty straightforward, but search is another aspect because people are not patient enough to go through the table of content and try to find out what they want. So use sophisticated search. That's one thing I do and invest in that. Next, with all the content that you want, might be different from what the organization needs. What is the content that aligns with product strategy and go-to-market strategy, something that brings in revenue through documentation. If you focus on great content, that is important for the team and the department in terms of style, type, and all of that. I'm doubtful that it'll bring revenue and success. Now, the questions to ask. These are the questions, example questions that I usually ask myself. A few examples, if you want to take a picture, I'm not going into the details of this. Let's move on to tools and processes. I usually segment documentation process and tools into 4 phases: planning, development, review, and publish. For each phase, I evaluate the processes and tools used by all of the stakeholders. All of the stakeholders is a very important key term for me because I don't really evaluate what writers use. I try to understand what each and every stakeholder use. Is there a difference among the tools that they use to do the same thing? These analysis would add a lot of value to finding the right tool. This is structured around identifying the stakeholders, understanding their needs, and selecting the right tools that enhance collaboration and productivity across teams. How do we select the right tools? Because it's not just about selecting the right tools for the writers and making their life easier. It is to optimize the documentation process for all contributors and stakeholders. We have to keep in mind, or I usually keep in mind, to enhance collaboration, contribution, and management across the board. Successful tool selection is something that is visible to all of the stakeholders, including engineers. Now, visibility is one thing. Are they using it? So making sure that it is something that they can use is another aspect of it. I was talking to Candy yesterday about the data structure and a lot of people talking about doc as code. I worked in an organization where data was the main tool that we used, but most of our documentation came from developers. They couldn't contribute, they couldn't review. So the entire tool set was a failure, even though it looked sophisticated from a writer's point of view. So it's important that it is visible and usable for all stakeholders. Seamless integration. Now, when you assess, you would see lots of processes and tools that you use are great. You don't have to change them. So when you introduce something new, make sure that whatever you introduce is you can integrate those with the existing ones. It shouldn't be decoupled or it shouldn't work as separate entities. It should be seamless and you should be able to integrate. scalable and future-proof. Very important aspect of selecting process and tools. 1 year ago in my organization, we picked a tool. That point in time, our challenge was different. The challenge was syncing open API specs and the changes into API documentation seamlessly. We focused on that. We picked a tool. Not we, the team picked a tool without considering the future needs. But fast forward to 1 year, our content needs have changed. We have scaled so much, the tool cannot do what we want to do. We had to do an overhaul and switch to a new tool. Now we are using a different tool, but good news is we are using AI, GPT-4 powered search, which is future-proof. And oh boy, it's so good. You should try it. And I'm here to talk about that tool if you want to after the session. Questions that you can ask in this session are listed here if you want to take a photo. Yep. I'll move on to the next one, which is resource planning, mapping skills to the needs. Now that you have pretty good understanding about the processes that you need, tools that you want to implement, content that you want to write, you know the ideal candidate that you need. But there is a team that already exists. So it's hard for us to just let go of the entire team and get the ideal resources. And do you get ideal resources? Very rare. The max that you can get is 70% match to the job requirement. This is where you map the skills with the needs. What I ideally do is I try to understand my team by figuring out how much of overlap there is between current resource and the ideal resource. If it's above 50%, you're good to go. Keep the team as is and do a strategic resource planning. How do you do that? I use skill matrix analysis. This helps me understand the strength of a team, each team member, and also the gaps. I try to leverage the skill sets, and depending on the gap, I put together development and learning plan for the team member, also considering what their interests are, making sure that it aligns with the organization goals, team goals, and individual goals. Assessment is something that I do to understand their practical skill application capabilities. This can include stakeholder communication, prioritization, planning, and getting things done. And if they need help in some areas, provide that help. With these two analysis and findings, I focus on goal setting and professional development, as I just said. And the gaps would help you diversify your team and focus on the required skills in your hiring process. This will also help you foster a learning environment which is collaborative and helpful for each other. Questions that you can ask. Uh-oh, I was a little quick there. Okay, if you want to take a picture. Now that I'm rushing because there's a lot to cover in this, and it's like end-to-end documentation department, so I'm sorry, but I'm here to talk about it more after the session if you want. Prioritization and implementation. Lots of data points to look at, lots of things to work on. How do we do this efficiently by planning, prioritizing, and then looking into the implementation? In a world where demand is always more than capacity, you as writers, most of you must be a part of understaffed technical writing team, always asking for more resource. So you can relate to this very well. Where I try to start is find out where to begin strategically and effectively. And I focus on multifaceted solutions. One stroke, so many challenges are resolved. That has always been my focus. Do not look into the details of these boxes. That's crap data. I don't know what I have put in there, but it's just a visual. So I try to see the box, which has so many branches, and I kick the big box, which has so many sub-boxes in it, and I get that done. Some techniques that you can use in strategic planning and prioritization, which should help you implement things easily. One is centralize improvement opportunities. Always, always keep a backlog and use a visual tool to communicate this with the entire organization, which will keep transparency and help the rest of the organization understand how you want to implement things and what is in the roadmap for the team. And that will also help you foster individual growth and team growth by looking at their skills and prioritizing those opportunities that would help the team grow. I always look for the opportunities that align with the skill set of the team because that gives them a boost of confidence and get buying from them. They are on board with you because you are a new manager who is trying to implement too many changes, and people usually don't like changes. Another most important aspect of prioritization is looking from the organization and user need perspective instead of departmental perspective, which is technical writing team perspective. Focusing on staying adaptive with evolving, changing requirements. Startup means dynamic. Today's priority is not next week priority. We keep change priorities every time with new technology, new opportunities, competitors releasing some new features. So be sure that something that I make sure is that staying adaptive and evolving with changing requirements. Again, to repeat, identify actions that effectively tackle multiple needs. One of the examples, I have two examples actually, but I cannot go into both of them, so I'll just talk about one. One of the concerns that I got from the team that I newly joined was, we need more resources, we have too much work, the workload is too much that we cannot handle. But getting answers to get specific data point, like how much of work do you deliver, what are the accomplishments, what are the challenges, how do you struggle and all that, was so hard to get answers for. So I implemented Scrum framework, and we started working in sprint, which gave me the understanding about the productivity of team over certain time periods, how they interact with SMEs, how they prioritize, can they plan. This also gave me insight into individuals who needed a little more help in their skills, communication, collaboration, and writing itself. It also helps us understand whether writers are doing 10 different things or are they rallying towards a specific goal. So the techniques that I use in prioritization are listed here, but I will only pick a few here. Rest of the things you can look into. There are lots of studies about each of them. One is impact analysis. I look into user impact, organizational impact, and market impact. Make a list of those things which has the most impact. Once that is identified, I look into the effort, the level of effort that each impact needs. Now that is identified, I see which one is quick win and which one is a long-term win. Quick wins are always prioritized because that makes you feel so good and brings in so much of recognition for your team and team members, which is already going through a lot of changes and implementing changes for the rest of the organization and stakeholders. Now, you have planned, prioritized, implement. I think this is the most challenging aspect for us writers, measuring the impact, especially within startup where the data points are way too minimum. I'll share a few things that I have learned over the time, which helps me measure the success of the implementation that I make. I prioritize resources over everything, and I believe that is the core of a team. It's people. This people-first approach always helped me yield high productivity, creativity, and overall project success, which are essential for sustainable organization growth. First, a skill development progress and professional growth index. Monitor the enhancement of skills, any professional achievements or growth within the team. Track those data points over time. Innovation and improvement suggestions. A happy, engaged team always comes up with new ideas and engagement suggestions. So it's a reflection of a team that is engaged. Track those ideas. Task completion rate and project success rate. I see this being the easiest data point to get if you're using the right tools like Jira. Look at the sprint velocity report, story points accomplished, epic panels. This gives you a pretty good insight and data points to understand the success. Team satisfaction. So easy to understand, send out surveys, user interviews, and feedback forms. One thing I want to focus here is retention. Most of the time, retention, how you retain, how much of the resources have been retained becomes a data point to measure the success. Sometimes it's not about retaining. It's about making sure that the team is successful as a team. Sometimes you have to identify people who don't perform, and you have to put together a path or a plan for them to excel and contribute to the team. You have to track their success, and if they are not able to accomplish what they have to, you have to make the right decision, because retaining doesn't always mean making the team successful. Sometimes it means making changes and bringing new people to make a better team. Now, efficiency in resource allocation. I usually look at story points over the time that the writer is able to do, and then I know I have a set expectation from that writer, and I also try to conduct user interviews with them to understand, are they satisfied with the workload that they have. Now, content metrics. This has been the most challenging aspect of my job. One, in startup, there are no customers. Second, even if there are customers, they don't use documentation, or the onboarding team never let them use documentation. Reason is they are scared if they give out the documentation for onboarding, they'll lose the customer. So the onboarding team or the solution team is sitting with the customer, hand-holding them to onboard. So how do we gather data in this kind of situations? One is user feedback scores. This is where I measure the usefulness of documentation. I usually use A/B testing and prototype testing. Prototype testing for templates for no type of documentation. A/B testing to understand post and pre-improvements, changes, and its impact. One thing that I make sure that while doing these tests are not to introduce any new variables in the survey while assessing pre and post changes impact. It will corrupt the data. If you want to measure success of a new measure, create a new survey, do a new testing, do a new research. Engagement analytics. We talked about DORA research yesterday, and I wish we all had that kind of situations where we had so many customers to give us input and engage with our documentation so that we can just look at the analytics tool, get our data, but it's not as straightforward as it is. So a few measures that I use here is use analytics tools or make sure that there is enough user engagement coming to your documentation site, which can reflect on the analytics tool. One is map your user journey to a workflow, create that kind of documentation set, and hand that over to your partners who are working with SI developers or customers or whoever that is, and then see if that brings in more engagement into your documentation, which means there are people who are looking at the documentation. Track community forum and support questions and see how much of the documentation are being used in resolving those queries. This will give you some good insight into the usage of the documentation. Content gap reduction. This is something that is very tricky, and I usually define a user group that I always use to understand pre and post content gap improvements. And then I usually go for user interviews to understand how they feel about the changes and improvements. Now, tools. Optimizing documentation tools is critical for increasing productivity and streamlining workflows. A few measures to evaluate the success, process efficiency improvements. Sometimes, if it's available in tool, for example, Jira, it's easy to measure. Otherwise, I go for user interviews. Next is review efficiency. Review is a generic term that I use with all the communication that happens between writers and rest of the stakeholders. How many wireframes reviews are happening? Are the wireframes, done before it is gone? It's going to front-end development. Do they change the design after being in the front-end development? If that's happening, how many iterations are the writers doing? And how to fix those iterations and just do once and for all. So those kind of analytics would help you bring efficiency in your review and track those numbers. adoption rate of tools. This is something that I already mentioned. Success of tools are when it's visible to everyone and when it's used. So track the number of people who use a new process or tools. This will give you insight into the success of the tools. Now, time to conclude. We have discussed about a lot of things. What are the key takeaways and the path forward? Who is the king here? Content. The content being the cornerstone, it needs utmost importance. Deliver high quality content which has rigorous guidelines, and it is also the fundamental and basic building unit of a great content strategy or documentation strategy. That's on which we build strategy, so make sure you have great content. Next, skilled and engaged team. Even with the most sophisticated process, you can only go so far. Without a skilled and engaged team, it's hard to bring in results. So I usually foster growth-oriented environment, which is essential for taking the organization forward. Catalyst role of tools and processes. Tools and processes are just not for writers. It is something that bridge the gap among the stakeholders. This is something that helps us align with the shared objective of the organization, and this is where operational excellence meets strategic planning. Last but not the least, adapting to unique organizational landscapes. Sorry. We live in a dynamic world. As I just mentioned, scopes change. And our strategy should be dynamic. And how dynamic? It should be as dynamic as the environment that we work in. Without having a strategy that can adapt to the unique landscape of the organization, it's hard to implement the strategy. Every organization is unique, just like our families. The needs are different, opportunities are different, challenges are different. So keep that in mind. So what is the success recipe for success for a documentation department? Exceptional content, robust tools and processes, and skilled and engaging team, and willingness to adapt to the ever-evolving landscape of the organization. I hope this has been useful and you get to take a few points to your company and make a great documentation team. Thank you. And this is my LinkedIn profile. If any of you want to connect, always happy to discuss anything about documentation and bringing in results. Thank you.
Sofiya, thank you again so much. It's a pleasure, and it's not often you get two former tweeps on stage without
Yes.
talking about other things. We've got awesome Q&A, so we're going to go ahead and work through that right now.
Yep.
But
I'll try to answer the best way possible, but if I don't have the answers, I'll meet you outside of the...
yeah, and just a reminder, if you've got Q&A, there are QR codes on the back doors. It's also slido.com with the entry code WTDPDX24. Again, that's slido.com, promo code WTDPDX24. All right. So from Sarah, who's been very active in our Q&A, good question here. How do you find the time to implement all of these analyses and strategies?
Because that's my job. I prioritize them and I go for planning sessions. So here is what I do. I keep a balance. At the beginning of every quarter, I allocate 30% of the time to departmental initiatives and rest of the time for product releases. And the time that I allocate for departmental initiatives, that's where I focus on bringing in changes in terms of processes, tools, and content style. So I don't know if I answered the question in the way that you were looking the answer for, but this is how I usually do so that I don't mix things up by putting everything in the backlog and just picking whenever I have time.
Okay, so making the backlog like the backup plan, kind of.
Yeah, so I put everything on the backlog, but then the planning is where I bring the implementation part into, and the planning has really allocated bandwidth for product releases versus the initiatives that I want to work on. 70 to 30% is the ratio that I usually go for.
Excellent, thank you. From Douglas here, you talked about matching skills to needs, and this part here, the maximum you get is 70%. Can you say more about that mismatch?
So the mismatches, especially with the evolving changes and the competitors. So you hire a writer. Today you hire a writer. I would give an example. 2 months ago, I hired a writer. And at that point in time, our requirements were creating great API documentation, how-to documentation, workflow documentation. But if you ask me, in next 6 months, we might be done with addressing all the content gap. We will go to implementing Pendo, maybe for user, tour and all of that within the UI. But my writers don't have that skill. That's something they might have to learn. And then now that the content gaps are addressed, I would like to create other collaterals, blogs, videos, and all of that. My writers might have or might not have the skill set because I didn't hire them to do that. The requirements were different. So every time when you map the needs to the skill set, you will see some kind of difference. And it's also very evident because every profession, I think that gap should always be there because addressing those gaps is what makes every one of us, including me, grow in our career. If there is no gap, if it's exact match, then it's saturation. You have to move on, find the gap, and then learn that. Then create more gaps, learn that, and then that's how you add skills onto your profile is what I believe in.
Yeah, like the right person in the right seat. And then
Exactly.
sometimes the seat changes.
Yeah.
And then you fit the seat later or you get a new seat.
Yeah, it's exactly like, we as humans, we start our life and then we get married and then we are just, married couple and then suddenly we become moms and dads and the requirements changed and then you are learning new skills and then you're like grandmother and requirement changes. So just like that, it's the same thing.
Yeah, like the diaper task I picked up last week. Yeah, that's
Tinky.
Very true. Yeah. From Douglas here, we have a question. You talked to, thank you again, Douglas. That was asked that question already. Here we have, did you get much pushback from when you first proposed this process? And if so, how did you convince them that this process is necessary?
What do you guys think? I always get pushback. So what I try to do is, I always tell this to my team as well, stick with the global guidelines. Take your name off the changes that you bring in. Often, whenever somebody says this, Sofiya wants to do, I tell them, I don't want to do this. I'm bringing in this change from this guidelines because I did this analysis and this is what I have discovered. And this is backed up by this research. And then I bring that as an idea that is not mine, but something that has come from people who have done the research or who knows it, because it's often the individual, and the egos involved in there and taking your ideas so personally. I bring the ideas to the table, and I'm not married to that. You take it or not. And once you do that, I have dealt with this. I was talking about this yesterday, day before. Once, there were these two terms, manhandling and hand-holding. And cute used in the documentation, technical documentation. So cute was easy to get rid of. The manhandling and hand-holding, especially in the context of translation, who are involved in that, would know it will translate into a very different term when you translate that, into another language. So I was like, I cannot use it. And the developers were so mad because they said, we are developers, we know what it means, you don't have to change it. But then I was like, no, tell me what you mean. I'll use it, equivalent term. You won't believe me, it got escalated till CPO, saying Sofiya is blocking our work by making changes unnecessarily to our drafts. I didn't respond to that by saying why I did this. I said, this is the guidelines I follow. This is what it means. If you want to use this kind of terms, we have to implement our own organizational guidelines. Do you want me to do that? Answer was, no, we don't have resource or time for that. Quick win. I didn't even have to argue. So use that kind of approach where you are not fighting. It's not your battle. You're not taking the accomplishments home by winning that battle and winning the lotto. It's for the organization. And I think the leadership, once they understand you are aligned with their interest, it's easy to win those kind of conversations.
Yeah, it's a huge win when you have it
Yeah.
documented that way, and like this is the process
Exactly.
we follow,
Yeah.
and we
Yeah.
want to make sure that
Yeah.
we're appropriate, or we've got those values in mind.
Yeah.
This question's got a lot of attention here. Can you talk about how this approach might be specific to startups, and are any of your recommendations less suited for larger or more mature companies?
So bigger companies, what I've seen is the transparency about the product strategy itself, it's not that great. We often end up just focusing on documentation improvement. I have worked as in the enterprise Avaya, NHP, which is like hundreds of writers, right? It's so hard to understand what this organization is trying to do because there are hundreds of products. Their strategy for each product is different, and there are people who are using legacy, who are using the new version. It's so hard to understand. But in a startup world, the easiest way to do anything is make leadership understand you are so aligned with the organization goals, and do your studies top to bottom, not bottom up. So I take the organization goals. For example, one of our key focus as an organization is to sell a particular part of the product. Now I start from there. This is our plan for the next quarter. That is where we want to bring revenue in. How can we support that as documentation team? And then they are listening now because I'm talking about bringing in revenue to whatever is on the roadmap for them. Then I go with, by standards and by my research, through my research, these are the findings that I have to make these improvements in the content, which will essentially bring result to your organization's goal or our organization's goal, which will also add value to your product release. So these kind of strategic conversations where you are adding values that is interesting for them and would bring result in their domain without them doing the work actually usually makes a lot of difference, in my opinion. And I think that's a mature way of doing it, instead of saying, this is what I want to do, this is how I want to make it happen, and all of that. So just make them feel that you don't care. All you care is about the organization goal, and just sell it. You deal with toddlers, so you know how to. I always keep my little daughter, 4-year-old daughter, on while I do this kind of conversation. When I want her to take a shower, I tell her, oh my God, these germs are so bad. You know what happens when people don't shower? There are germs everywhere. And she suddenly is like, Mama, should I shower? Let's go shower. But if I tell her, okay, you have to shower now because you have to go to daycare, I only have 5 minutes, I'm not getting her to the washroom. So, I use the same tactics when I have to talk to stakeholders, exactly the same thing.
Yeah, when you really speak to them on that level.
Exactly, yeah.
We've got time for one more question here. And this is about user feedback. So how do you score user feedback and measure engagement as if, the onboarding team is protecting users from the docs?
I usually set up a lot of calls with them. And I understand. I go step by step, and I show so much empathy. I tell them, oh my God, you're spending so much time with these developers. It must be so frustrating because every developer has different questions, and each time they get in touch with you, you're trying to figure out these answers. Why don't I create something for you that has all the answers? They're happy. And then I did that. I created a quick start guide. And I asked the person, help me understand the challenges that you go through. Let me put together a guide just for you. I'm not even going to publish. I'm helping you. And then I helped him. Then he started getting back to me with each and every challenge that he was facing. And he even asked me, Sofiya, can you put together a workflow which would map the user journey so that I can share this workflow for each developer to get things done? And that brought in a lot of results. And I have the measure for that. It actually brought in somewhere close to 90% improvement in the documentation. Yeah.
That's an excellent statistic to end on. Thank you, Sofiya, everyone.
Thank you.
Sofiya M. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure.